Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online developmental psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in psychology. This week, we're going to talk about gender and sexuality, so let's get into it. Beginning with some basic definition, biological sex is defined as physical characteristics that define male and female, and gender, which is defined as psychological characteristics, including behaviors, thoughts, emotions, and sense of self associated with being male or female. It incorporates features that society associates with or considers appropriate for men and women. Continuing on with definitions, gender roles are defined as patterns of behavior that females and males should adopt in a particular society. Gender role norms are society's expectations of or standards concerning what males and females should be like. And gender stereotypes, which are overgeneralized and largely inaccurate beliefs about the characteristics of all males and all females. They're generated by society's gender norms, and many originate from a grain of truth. Studies have found that men and women describe themselves more similarly in the 90s than men and women in the 70s. So basically our big takeaway here is that we have particular societies' understandings of how males and females should act, and based on those expectations, we evaluate an individual's perceived gender-based behavior and assign them whatever particular descriptors depending on their conformity to or kind of non-alignment with those gender expectations in societies. And gender stereotypes, kind of the big takeaway here is that as time has gone on, and this study just looking at gender, how the men and women kind of describe themselves, the degrees of differences between those self-descriptions has rapidly closed, or decreased, I should say. The differences have in those self-descriptors have decreased through the decades. So in this case, the study comparing 70s and 90s. So kind of just reflecting that these gender roles and these norms are embedded within particular historical periods, and within and consequently particular social arrangements, economic and political systems. And when those change, you see differences in degree of differences in self-descriptors, or just kind of more generally patterns of behavior between the genders. Gender differences or similarities. Early research on gender focused on trying to reveal the differences of any size or value between men and women. Janet Hyde argues for gender similarities. The gender similarities hypothesis: males and females are similar on most, but not all psychological variables, more alike than different. So kind of the idea here, and you see this across psychology, is really just searching for, in this case, gender differences, but you can see this with racial differences, or kind of just group differences in general, for kind of no rhyme or reason. Just as an attempt to kind of, distinguish between particular groups, what social purpose that kind of method of investigation exactly is, can often reflect kind of pre-existing kind of disparities within a culture. So that could be, whatever, racism, ageism, sexism, etc. So kind of just looking for often justification for these structural barriers to particular groups. But I mean, that's kind of the significant pitfalls of kind of using that approach. But it's just in general in research. If you don't really have a hypothesis why these differences in groups exist, you're kind of just fishing for data. And it kind of, so anyway, one of the famous neuroscientists that kind of argue this, or psychologists more broadly, is Janet Hyde, and basically argues that most of the differences that we see are basically products of particular socializations, patterns within particular societies, And because of that, patterns of socialization, those differences in activities across genders, that will obviously be reflective in neurological activity and kind of the ability for particular genders within particular historical eras performing differently on whatever tasks, or they can be behavioral or kind of neuroimaging studies, for example. So I'm going to kind of walk through kind of a couple common claims. The first being that females display greater verbal abilities. However, this difference is small. Males outperform females on many tests of spatial ability, and previous training studies can reduce or eliminate gender differences in spatial abilities. And females and males perform similarly on most, but not all, standardized math tests. Historically, males outperform females on standardized tests of math, but advantage has been shrinking in the U.S. and many other countries. Females obtain slightly higher math grades in classrooms. So again, this is kind of just reflecting shifts in access to universities, but not just universities, but just kind of schooling in general, and having to work in a workforce, really. So rather than these kind of being these innate biological processes, they might just reflect a particular moment in history and a particular cultural context. Specifically, something like 1950s United States, wherein there was just record levels of wealth, and you only had to have one member of the household working. But after decades of kind of income and wealth stagnation for most of the country, more women are having to enter the workforce, kind of through economic necessity, but also various movements for more political representation and whatnot. But the big takeaway here is that these claims are generally not found in research, and where differences are found, they're typically small, or they are eliminated with training. And this is also just kind of in the United States context. We'll talk about other cultures moving forward in this lecture. So continuing on, males engage in more physical and verbal aggression than females. However, girls tend to use more subtle, indirect relational forms of aggression as well. Boys are more physically active, and boys are more developmentally vulnerable. So, as we talked about in previous lectures, kind of the idea that boys are expected to behave violently or aggressively, or just kind of adolescence overall, is not found across all cultures, or I should say the frequency in which that is cited and expected varies significantly across cultures. And some societies, such as like small subsistence societies, don't expect it at all. And here in the U.S., typically we see differences of aggression and the type of aggression expressed. And also you can see here boys are being more physically active, with kind of also reflecting certain historical conditions, wherein girls' sports programs are kind of underfunded and kind of underemphasized compared to boys' sports. So again, kind of reflective of kind of societal values and priorities, really, due to funding and emphasis within schools more on boys' sports than girls' sports. And boys are more developmentally vulnerable. This has a grain of truth through it. We've talked about it in previous lectures, but the idea here is that basically the chromosomes that make up a boy, a fetus, possibly makes them more developmentally vulnerable. And really that's not required for this chapter, but kind of that's just the idea here, is that because females have XY chromosomes, or I should say XX chromosomes, and males have XY chromosomes. Kind of that extra X chromosome allows for kind of more buffering. If some damage happens to an X chromosome, kind of female fetuses can kind of, on a genetic level, kind of fall back on the other X chromosome. But that's, again, not required for this class. But that's kind of what this is alluding to on a biological level. Average levels of a behavior may be noticeably different for males and females. Within each sex, however, there is variability. Why do unfounded stereotypes persist? Social role theory argues that there are differences in the roles that women and men play in society create and maintain stereotypes. Define the roles played in society as innate. So kind of the idea here is that what we talked about in a previous discussion, where there's group averages, but then there's significant variabilities within group. And that variability within group is quite large, as as we discussed in that discussion post on group differences across cultures. And the social role theorists argue that stereotypes exist, particularly when talking about gender stereotypes, is that men and women have defined roles within society, and that kind of just reinforces our pre-existing stereotypes. So we have stereotypes, and we look around us and we see men and women acting in particular ways, which confirms our stereotypes. And then because of that, we kind of come to the conclusion that this is innate, some kind of biological role and difference found across these two genders. So kind of creating the social conditions, making or having certain cultural values, or just particular circumstances create particular gender roles. People look around them, see those gender roles being enacted, which confirms their stereotype, and then people saying, oh, I guess this is kind of just natural / biological / innate. So let's talk about differential treatments. Differences between males and females at birth are small and inconsistent. Male newborns tend to be somewhat more irritable, and female newborns are somewhat more alert than males. Parents tend to use masculine terms for newborn boys, such as commenting on their strength of kicks and their cries. And girls' infants are likely to be labeled sugar, sweetie, described as soft, cuddly, and adorable. So kind of the idea here is that they are little to inconsistent differences at birth, and through differential treatment, in this case here, describing the child, to the child, in masculine or feminine terms, for really the same behaviors. So, for boys, kind of being described in more masculine term, using masculine terms to talk to them or kind of describe their behavior, and in young girls, parents or caregivers are just kind of anyone you interact with, being more likely to use feminine terms and kind of label them as sugar, sweetie, and soft and cuddly. So kind of those traditional feminine traits. And through time, kind of these differences of treatment, and this again just kind of one example, produces, or at least for young children, kind of begins that path of particular gender roles in society. So it's kind of like a culturalization process that places children on a kind of developmental trajectory to adhering to particular gender roles. So a classic example of this is on gender stereotyping was when researchers had students watch videos of two infants, and they were introduced as Dana or David, the students interpreted strong reaction to Jack-in-the-Box toy as anger when introduced as David, interpreted strong reaction to toy as fear when introduced as Dana. So kind of the idea here is that students are going to be shown two children, one male, one female, reacting to this Jack-in-the-Box, and what the researchers did was select two children who have literally the exact same reaction, and then they split students up into two groups, wherein some students watched the boys' reaction and some students watched the girls' reaction. And what the researchers found was that the university students who watched the boys' reaction, they rated or they described the boys' action as kind of through angry descriptors. While students who watched the girls' reaction to the Jack-in-the-Box, again, the exact same reaction, they described her reaction as fearful, and so kind of more of those vulnerable terms. So you can see here the difference is the exact same behavior, one being described as anger, one being described as fearful, and this is kind of an example of differential treatment through time kind of shaping and affecting developmental outcomes. Early learning. In a study of 3 to 8 month old infants, males spent more time looking at a truck. Females spent more time looking at a doll, which suggests that rudimentary recognition of gender stereotypic information. By 24 months, they look longer at males and females performing gender inconsistent activities. So, kind of the idea here, this is like the classic gaze study where we try and infer certain kind of cognitive states or understandings of the world based on infants' duration of looking at something. So in this case, males spend more time looking at trucks, females looking more at dolls, which kind of suggests that this socialization in gender roles starts very early on in development. Also, by 24 months, infants will look at will gaze longer at kind of gender non-conforming gender stereotypical behavior, which kind of suggests that this is a novel thing, and therefore I'm going to look at it longer because I'm interested in this novel, unique thing that I'm not expecting to see. And by 18 months, most toddlers seem to have an emerging understanding that they are either like other males or like other females. Girls as young as 24 understand which activities are associated with males and which with females. Boys do not show the same understanding until 6 months later. By age 2.5 to 3 years old, most children give verbal proof of gender identity, awareness that they're either a boy or a girl. So again, here we can see that through early socialization, children come to understand what activities are associated with males and which activities are associated with females in their culture. And with young girls, kind of developing this understanding at a quicker rate on average than boys, these studies found, which could suggest that girls have higher or receive kind of more differential treatment or kind of just more environmental cues or kind of just environmental or more environmental information about their expectations or the expectations of a young girl or kind of just girls in general. So maybe a higher levels of gender role norms being, or more frequent gender role norms, expectations being socialized in girls at a younger age, perhaps. And through that kind of accumulation of more social learning, theorists would argue, they are quicker to understand, differences in which activities, I should say, are associated with males and which activities are traditionally associated with females. And in infancy, there is evidence that there's the beginnings of a sexual self, which supports Freud's argument that infants are sexual beings. Young infants derive pleasure from oral activities. Both males, babies, and female activities have been observed to touch and manipulate their genital areas, experience a physical arousal, and undergo what appears to be orgasms. So kind of, again, going back to classic Freud thing, where development is very much centered around kind of sexual tension or just, or all development really is kind of centered around these early sexual development outcomes, which again kind of affects lifelong outcomes. And there's some evidence that suggests that infancy and the beginnings of sexual self begins quite early in infancy. Acquiring gender stereotypes in childhood. Young children rapidly acquire gender stereotypes. Children become aware that they are biological males or females and acquire motives, values, and patterns of behavior that culture considers appropriate for members of their biological sex. And kind of the idea here, if you look to your right on your PowerPoint slides, that you kind of see a dip here in the children's flexible responses to gender stereotypes. So you kind of see this more rigid understanding of gender as children kind of acquire these gender stereotypes, and at the same time kind of not having the, some people would argue, not having the cognitive capacity to be cognitively flexible with those stereotypes. So children kind of adopt these gender stereotypes as like, these universal claims that are unchanging, unmovable. They have not acquired yet the capacity to be cognitively flexible. So you see children become less flexible with kind of gender norms in that as they advance into kind of middle childhood. Continuing on with acquiring gender stereotypes. 2 to 3-year-olds children seem to understand society's gender stereotypes and act in gendered ways. By age 5, boys hold more gender stereotypical toy preferences than girls. Rigidity about gender stereotypes, high during the preschool years, around ages 4 to 7, decreases over the elementary school years. Some research suggests that children's rigidity about gender role violations depends on how essential a behavior is to children's understanding of gender identity. Younger children are acquiring understanding that their biological sex will remain constant, intolerant of anyone who violates traditional gender standards. So here, kind of the big takeaway here is that we see a shift at age 5 with boys preferring more gender stereotypical toys than girls, and that can be for a whole host of reasons. With one being that the toys that are gender stereotypical toys for boys are just that stereotypical, and they reflect a particular era of understanding of gender roles and expectations that do not exist. Thus, young girls maybe are more likely to interact with traditionally boy toys, but at the same time, boys may face more pressure to adhere to gender role expectations to girls that young girls may not necessarily have, or just it's different for boys, the types of societal pressures that they face, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Rigidity about gender stereotypes. So we kind of talked about this in the previous slide. The idea here is that rigidity goes up between 4 to 7 years of age, kind of that early to mid childhood, and then slowly decreases. Some researchers argue that the rigidity of those gender stereotypes are not kind of this universal thing, but rather if the child believes that a particular behavior is essential to that gender, and thus that's gender stereotype, that they're more rigid about those types of gender behaviors. But if it's something that they really don't have much information on, or they don't value it as reflecting a key difference in gender, they are less rigid about that violation of gender stereotype. So, for example, if they saw their father or a caregiver, male caregiver, cooking dinner or something, they might not lose their mind and scream at their dad that they have violated gender stereotypes. But if they see their dad, in the United States at least, wearing female stereotype clothes, they may be more rigid in kind of their condemnation, whatever that means at 5 years old, of kind of like their fathers or their male caregivers' behavior. Gender type behavior. Children behave in gender appropriate ways. Boys tend to choose boy toys, girls choose girl toys. Some research shows that occasionally boys and girls choose boy toys. Boys spend more time playing video games, and is that still true today? Children begin to favor same-sex playmates as early as 30 to 36 months of age. Elementary school gender segregation. So kind of the idea here is that, and a point that I want to highlight, which was mentioned in the book, offhandedly, that boys spend more time playing video games. That's actually not true. With some studies finding that women actually play more games, or I should say female adolescents play more than male adolescents video games. Or other studies find that they're basically the same. But kind of the key point here is that these, and this is kind of reflective of that these kind of gender roles or this gender behavior shifts through time. So in 2006, this author is talking about boys playing more video games than girls, but that difference is either flipped or non-existent in 2019. And another kind of way that socialization of gender type behavior and gender roles in general occurs is through education. So children obviously spend a lot more time in school as they grow older, and elementary schools tend to be gender segregated. And this helps reinforce or just kind of develop and expose children to particular gender roles and gender stereotypes, which may contribute to that kind of sudden spike in gender rigidity that occurs beginning in the preschool years. And continuing on with gender type behavior, preschool girls who start the school year playing with boys end up in gender segregated groups later in the year. Socialization pressures. Non-conforming peers have fewer peer interactions, fewer socialization opportunities. Boys face stronger pressures to adhere to gender role expectations. Might explain why they develop strong gender type preferences. Tomboys versus mama's boy, no equal term. People still believe it is less desirable for boys to behave in gender non-conforming ways than girls. All right, so let's unpack this. So kind of the study here in the first bullet point is looking at girls in the beginning of their preschool school year playing and interacting with boys at higher frequency than at the end of the school year. And this could be due to socialization pressures and kind of just overall gender segregation within schools. But evidence for socialization pressures has been found in the fact that non-conforming peers, that is, girls who do not follow girl stereotypical behavior, have fewer peer interactions and fewer socialization opportunities. So not only are these kind of norms existing around you and influencing your development, but also it's also further influenced by peer-to-peer interaction, with non-conforming peers having fewer peer interactions, which doesn't feel good. So children can adapt to that by adopting gender stereotypical behavior. And of course, this is not going on at a super conscious level, but kind of a general understanding with a child that the way that they're acting, for example, is kind of like weird. So then they can change their behavior in more stereotypical ways. And by the end of the school year, this means that more segregated or gender segregated groups of children are more segregated by gender. And male-female interaction decreases throughout the school year. And next, as I was alluding to in the previous slides, boys face stronger pressure to adhere to gender role expectations. So kind of the idea here is that there is no term for a young boy who acts in quote-unquote typically girl ways. So there's a term, tomboy, which is associated with girls acting in stereotypically male ways, but that kind of cross gender, the opposite term does not exist among boys. So there's mama's boy, and there's no such term as tom girl or something along those lines, which kind of reflects that still in at least in the United States, the idea that boys are going to behave in non-gender stereotypical ways is more frowned upon than girls acting in non-stereotypical ways, which kind of then reflects these larger kind of societal environmental pressures, just kind of more broadly stated, that can contribute to the likelihood of boys kind of having more gender stereotypical toy preferences than girls, and kind of really being sure to kind of point out and kind of establish their masculinity. So moving on to another theory of gender role development, and that's the biosocial theory. This theory focuses on ways in which biological events influence the development of boys and girls. Early biological developments influence how people react to a child. It suggests that these social reactions have to do with children's assuming gender roles. So kind of the idea here that there are biological biological developments that occur, but alongside those biological developments, children interact with the world, obviously, and those interactions with the world, and especially early on, caregivers influences the likelihood of assuming gender roles. So we kind of have this biological innate process interacting with these environmental factors, contributing to the likelihood of a child adopting particular gender roles. Gender role development, social learning theory. So now we're going to talk about social learning theory in childhood. And social learning theorists argue that children learn masculine and feminine identities, preferences, and behaviors through two processes. First, differential reinforcement, and the second, observational learning. Gender role development. They ask which behaviors do people reinforce or punish, and what sorts of social models are available in a specific culture in a specific historical period of time. And we're going to expand on this in the next slides. And beginning with differential reinforcement, children are rewarded for sex-appropriate behaviors, punished for behaviors considered more appropriate for members of the other sex. Sons on average are more spanked than daughters. By second year of life, parents discourage cross-sex play. Parents who show the clearest patterns of differential reinforcement have children who are relatively quick to label themselves as girls or boys and to develop strongly sex-type toy and activity preferences. Fathers tend to explicitly express gender stereotypes. Mothers provide more implicit stereotypes, such as throwing away a math camp brochure for their daughter. So kind of the idea here is that through differential reinforcement, and that is children being rewarded for sex-appropriate behaviors and punished for when they kind of violate those sex-appropriate behaviors. That kind of pattern of reinforcement contributes to the adoption of particular gender roles. And one example is sons on average being more spanked than daughters, and this could reflect kind of this physical reinforcement of gender role violations, and also just kind of how to interact with the world, possibly leading to greater rates of aggression, or contributing to, I should say, greater rates of aggression, at least within an American context. And some studies have found that parents who show the clearest patterns of differential reinforcement, so that is reinforcing sex-appropriate behaviors and punishing sex-inappropriate behaviors, so kind of behaviors that don't conform to gender stereotypes or gender roles, have children with higher have children who, or I should say, their children describe themselves as in gender-specific ways at higher frequency than parents who have lower levels of discouragement of cross-sex play, or kind of lower enforcement of gender stereotypes. So kind of the degree to which that parents discourage cross-sex play or kind of enforce sex-appropriate behaviors influences the preferences of children's sex-type toys. So their preference for boys to play with a truck and girls to play with dolls, for example, and also to label themselves through gender stereotypical ways. And research suggests that these differential reinforcements are reinforced differently on average between mothers and fathers, with fathers being more explicit and mothers kind of being more implicit. So in this case, math camp brochure for a daughter, that's kind of violating a gender stereotypes. For example, that young girls aren't good at math or can never be have a career in some kind of math-related field. So therefore, just throw it away, and then the child can never interact with it, thus kind of reinforcing the particular developmental trajectory that conforms to particular gender roles. And this sets of differential reinforcement and even observational learning as well can contribute to self-fulfilling prophecies. Parents influenced by societal stereotypes about gender differences in ability expect their sons to outperform their daughters in math. Parents attribute their son's success in math to ability, but credit their daughters to hard work. Fathers use more scientific terms and provide more detailed explanations than with daughters. Children begin to internalize their parents' views. Girls report they are less competent and more anxious about performance than boys. Thinking they lack ability, girls become less interested in math and take less math courses, unlikely to pursue math-related careers. So kind of the idea here is that over time, Parents who are influenced by societal stereotypes. They obviously grew up in the same society, the same culture that you did, even if it's kind of a different historical era. But they have those societal stereotypes, which then they are going to parent based kind of on those stereotypes. And in this case, for differences in mathematical ability, parents expect their sons to outperform their daughters in math. And you can see this in the likelihood of parents attributing their son's success to kind of this innate ability that just naturally occurs, while daughter's success is when their daughter does kind of defy that gender stereotype and perform well in math, they attribute not to kind of this innate ability of mathematics, but rather through kind of this hard work where she was able to overcome kind of that innate disadvantage in mathematical ability. And through time, as parents use more scientific terms, children kind of internalize these views of their parents. And this is reflected in the fact that daughters self-report themselves as competent and more anxious. And because they view themselves as less confident, more anxious, and might as well hold those same innate those thoughts that mathematics reflects kind of this biological, this innate ability. There's really no point of trying, which we talked about in kind of previous classes with performance goals, but kind of the same principle here. There's no point in trying. So because I think I lack ability, I can't really become that good at it. My parents are really not enforcing it. Society's really not, I should say, reinforcing or encouraging my mathematical pursuits. I'm going to become less interested in it, take less math courses, and pursue less math related careers, and consequently might perform less or more poorly on standardized mathematical tests. So that's how the self-fulfilling prophecy, one example of self-fulfilling prophecy trajectory. Next, observational learning. Children see which boys and activities are for girls and which are for boys. Imitate individuals of their own sex, and they learn from the media such as the internet, television, movies, and video games. Children who see their mothers perform agetic tasks and their fathers perform household/child care tasks tend to be less aware of gender stereotypes and less gendered than children exposed to traditional gender models at home. Boys with sisters and girls with brothers have less gender-typed activity preferences than children who grow up with same-sex siblings. So this is kind of straightforward here. You're literally learning kind of gender roles and appropriate behaviors for your gender through observation. So observation can be from media, but also kind of just everybody around you. And when children see those different, or I should say, kind of uncommon actions by their parents, and uncommon being a historically relevant term, but so for example, if they see their father perform household childcare tasks, so kind of like Mr. Mom situation, maybe stay-at-home dad, they're going to grow up in a circumstance where they have different ideas of particular gender stereotypes. So in this case, the traditional idea of mother staying at home and father's going to work. In this case, if they see their father staying at home, and that's all they know, they've only known one father, especially at a young age, they are not going to adopt that gender stereotype because it kind of just doesn't make sense. Or that gender stereotype will be way less salient to their conceptualizations of gender differences because it just doesn't exist in their environment. And you can also see this with boys with sisters versus same-sex siblings, because they're interacting with their sibling and they're obviously going to be playing together on a variety of tasks. They are going to have lower endorsement of particular gender-typed activity preferences because they're just playing with their sister, and it's kind of just normal. That is normal to them. That is the norm. That is kind of the stereotype due to this differences in the household environment in which they grew up. Our next theory is the cognitive developmental theory. Gender role development depends on stage-like changes in cognitive development. Children must acquire understanding of gender before they will be influenced by their social experiences. Children actively socialize themselves. They actively seek same-sex models and a range of information about how to act like a girl or a boy, and are not passive targets of social influence. Children must first understand that they are boys or girls, and then actively seek same-sex models and a range of information about how to act like a boy/girl. So kind of the idea here, and we're going to expand on this momentarily, is that children, that there are stage-like changes. So this kind of goes back to the Piaget and Kohlberg kind of theories. As children reach certain ages, they acquire certain cognitive abilities, which will allow them to kind of interact with the world and act on the world and receive particular information and interpret particular environmental information in kind of new, efficient, and effective ways. So in this case of gender role development, once a child reaches a stage wherein that they can understand gender, then they can be influenced by gender and also actively socialize themselves by seeking out same-sex models and just information about gender stereotypes or differences in genders. So, as I stated, Kohlberg is a stage theorist, and Kohlberg believed that children progress through 3 steps to acquire gender consistency. Basic gender identity is established by 2 to 2.5 years old, can recognize and label themselves as male or female. Around age 3, children acquire gender stability, come to believe that gender is stable. Age 5 to 7, children achieve gender consistency, realizing that their sex is also stable across situations, can't be altered by playing a girl's game. So kind of the idea here is that children through time understand that their gender is stable, and just because they're playing a boy or a girl's game does not mean that they're just going to morph into a completely different human being. And as kind of this cognitive understanding, these cognitive abilities improve, then kind of going back to what I said before, then they're able to acquire understandings of gender and interact and socialize themselves by interacting with the world around them. Arguments against Kohlberg's theory. Not all research supports Kohlberg's theory of gender development. Gender who had acquired only the first step in the process began to engage in more gender-type play. Children who have younger siblings often arrive at an understanding of sex differences earlier than children with only older siblings or those without siblings. Most controversial claim, only when children fully grasp what their biological sex is unchangeable do they seek same-sex models. Only a rudimentary understanding of gender is required before children learn gender stereotypes and preferences. So these are kind of just general critiques that you'll find in all stage theorists, but the idea here is that people, in this case children, arrive at different kind of abilities at different times, and you can see it's not just that you achieve all these kind of abilities at each stage, but rather achieve some abilities at one step, or we'll just call it stage 1. You can have some abilities from stage 2 or 3, and at stage, say you enter stage 2, maybe you haven't mastered all stage 1 abilities, and maybe you also have kind of stage 4 abilities, just abstractly speaking. So this is kind of idea that it's not this clean stepping stage-like process. And kind of examples being that children who have younger siblings often arrive at understanding of sex differences earlier than children with older siblings. So just kind of being exposed to siblings who are different sex than you, influencing your kind of developmental trajectory and understanding of particular gender stereotypes. And some people argue that because of that, his most controversial claim is that when children fully grasp that their biological sex is unchangeable, do they seek same-sex models? While researchers basically argue that no, that's not the case, and even before children understand that they can't just randomly morph into a boy or a girl, based on whatever, playing with trains or something. Even before that, children are able to kind of acquire and learn particular gender stereotypes that exist within their society, and kind of evidence of that would be going back to even in really young ages, kind of children gazing at behaviors that violate gender stereotypes more than behaviors that kind of conform stereotypes. Again, kind of representing this idea that this is a novel, unique thing, and I'm like, oh, I'm super interested in this, so I'm going to gaze at it longer. Our next theory is gender schema theory, and it's kind of similar to Kohlberg's theory. Children are intrinsically motivated to acquire values, interests, and behavior consistent with cognitive judgments about self. Different than Kohlberg, self-socialization begins as soon as children acquire a basic gender identity. Children acquire gender schemas, organized sets of beliefs and expectations about males and females that influence the kinds of information they will attend to and remember. Use in-group, out-group schema that allows them to classify some objects, behaviors, and roles as appropriate for specific sex, then seek out elaborate information about the role of their own sex, constructing their own sex schema. So kind of the idea here is that children acquire these beliefs and expectations about gender. They then are intrinsically motivated to be consistent with these cognitive judgments about themselves, and this process of socialization begins early on as a child. And children use kind of these in-group, out-group schemas that allows them to kind of compare, in this case, the in-group and out-group being, whatever gender that they are, or that they believe that they are. So they will, say I'm a boy, I can recognize that this person here is a girl, if they're acting in a particular way. And therefore, I am going to actively seek out information and kind of be attuned to, just more generally, information that is kind of consistent with those cognitive evaluations. So so you're developing these cognitive abilities. You're motivated to kind of be consistent with your cognitive judgments about yourself, in this case gender, and through that intrinsic motivation and the development of those cognitive abilities, you actively seek out information that is consistent with those cognitive judgments of gender, and also kind of just rely on basic in-group, out-group schemas, aka kind of like expectations, that allows them to just kind of sort through behavior, say, okay, this person's in group, this person's out group, this behavior they're doing, performing is kind of consistent with my in group and out group, and that categorization process allows them to kind of develop their own understanding or further their understanding of their own sex and create their own sex schemas, which again, kind of your belief and expectations about males and females. So children are active agents. This socialization begins early and it's reflective in these kind of developing cognitive abilities, and which then allow for particular socializations abilities or socialization practices within their immediate environment. So an example of this, a more concrete example, would be a young girl knows her basic gender identity, might first learn that sewing is for girls and building model airplanes is for boys. Because she is a girl and wants to add consistency with her own self-concept, she gathers information about sewing to add to her own sex schema, largely ignores any information that comes her way about how to build model airplanes. So this idea is that she understands that she's a girl. She learns from her immediate environment that there are particular activities that girls participate in this case sewing, and she also learns that there are particular activities that boys participate in this case building model planes. She understands she is a girl and wants to kind of act consistently with this understanding of herself. So she will not only just seek out information related to sewing and other girl-related behaviors, but she will also ignore behaviors and kind of just activities that are traditionally thought as boy behaviors, and thus she'll forget about it, she won't participate in it, and thus these gender differences over time will emerge. Childhood sexuality. Young children construct their own understanding of reproduction before being told by assimilating and accommodating information into their existing cognitive structures. And as young people mature cognitively, they are able to construct even more accurate understanding of sexuality and reproduction. Freud is correct that preschoolers are highly curious about their bodies. At least 50% of children engage in sexual play / exploration. Freud is incorrect that these activities occur infrequently among school-age children. The majority of boys and girls have masturbated by age 13. By age 10 is an important point in sexual development. Many boys and girls experience their first sexual attraction, and it's thought to be influenced by the adrenal glands, which release sex hormones. So kind of this idea of through time, there's a combination of understanding of their gender and these biological shifts as they approach puberty, children experiencing higher rage or just kind of their first sexual attraction around the 10 years of age. Sexual abuse. Estimates of prevalence vary, but may be widespread. One study found that 25% of women and 16% of men reported having been sexually molested. Many children do not tell anyone. One estimate is that only 1 in 4 children report being abused within the first 24 hours of abuse, while 1 in 4 remain silent forever. And these are kind of like all these kind of self-report studies, wherein it's always underreported, and it's very difficult to get an exact number, but it's kind of generally thought that the numbers that we do have are underestimated because most people have abused, or a significant portion of people who experience abuse never report it to anyone, and thus it would not be reflected in the data. Impact of sexual abuse. There is no one distinct syndrome for all abuse victims. About 25% of boys and girls experience symptoms like anxiety, depression, aggression, withdrawal, and school learning problems. Many after effects involve a lack of self-worth and difficulty trusting. Approximately a third sexually act out, behave seductively, or promiscuously. Theorize that this sexualized behavior helps survivors master control of the traumatic event. So kind of the idea here is that following abuse, a child or kind of just an individual in general, want to kind of regain control of their body and kind of the environment around them. So then they, about a third in this survey, finding about a third sexually acting out and more promiscuously because, or kind of as an adaptive function, as a way to master control or take control of the traumatic event and kind of just yourself more generally. Continuing on, the impact of sexual abuse. Some display post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, clinical disorder involving nightmares, flashbacks, helplessness, and anxiety. In a few cases, the result of abuse is severe psychological damage. About a third seem to experience no psychological symptoms. Some may experience problems later. Might be a cumulative effect. Impact may be most severe when abuse involves penetration, occurs over a long period of time, and perpetrator is a close relative. So kind of the idea is post-stress disorder symptoms instead of the disorder itself. So what clinicians will do is basically to be classified with post-PTSD or kind of a lot of these disorders. In this case is anxiety disorder. You have to meet X amount of symptoms, and if you don't meet, the required amount of symptoms, then you technically don't have the disorder. But what they'll do is they'll say that you have PTSD, in this case PTSD symptoms. So you don't necessarily meet the clinical threshold, but you still have a lot of these symptoms. So in this case, nightmares, flashbacks, helplessness, and anxiety. And kind of like throughout this class, as we discuss, individuals who have high degrees of ACEs, that is adverse childhood events, are maybe more at our highest risk for long-term psychological damage from sexual abuse because of this kind of cumulative effect of stress over time. And the impacts of sexual abuse can vary depending on the relationship of the abuser and the exact type of abuse that occurs. Recovery factors of sexual abuse. High-quality relationship with parents and friends may lead to better recovery. Psychotherapy aids in treatment of abuse victims. Helps treat anxiety and depression, teaching coping and problem-solving skills to reduce likelihood of revitalization. So kind of these relationships acting as a buffering effect, that is, or a protective factor, that is reducing the kind of the negative effects associated with sexual abuse, and then psychotherapy aids and treatment of abuse victims. And I should also add, you can imagine scenarios where where abuse is ongoing, and in a relationship or a household, and then either a husband, wife, or child is stuck in that household and unable to move. And one recovery factor could be just like public housing, the ability for someone who's abused kind of leaving their household, acting as kind of a buffer effect. So this kind of goes back to those larger macro systems and this public policy wherein having a way to seek distance from the abuse in a safe location, contributing to and buffering, protecting abuse victims of long-term negative long-term developmental outcomes. Sexual offenders. Some offenders are juveniles taking advantage of peers or somewhat younger children, and these juveniles can learn acceptable behaviors. Effective intervention involving working with the survivors, the offenders, and all children on prevention of sexual abuse may be behind recent decline in reports of abuse. So kind of the idea is that the reports of abuse, some studies have found that they decrease, and this can be due to kind of the different interventions now used. And one of it's kind of teaching offenders kind of more pro-social ways to behave in society. Adhering to gender roles in adolescence. 8th graders understand gender role expectations are social conventions and can be changed. Gender intensification occurs, process where gender differences may be magnified by hormonal changes of puberty and increased pressure to conform to gender roles. It doesn't have to be real. Adolescents' perceptions of their peers' thoughts and expectations can affect their behaviors and lead to gender intensification. So we've kind of saw this in previous chapters with this imaginary audience idea. So there, obviously are, pressures to conform to gender roles, but also there could be to have peers or individuals around them that do not wish to conform to those gender roles, or just have a kind of a less a commitment to those gender roles than what a adolescent may believe, but they may imagine an audience that is really focusing on them, investigating or kind of interrogating their conformity to gender roles, and thus kind of creating this process by which they are then going to behave in more gender stereotypical ways. Transgender youth. Transgender refers to individuals who identify with a gender other than their biological one. They face a very difficult path, particularly because society largely regards sex and gender as the same thing. And many people who are cisgender have a difficult time understanding how someone's gender could possibly fail to align with his or her biology. Being transgender does not determine sexual orientation. Transgender youth. Transgender identity adds to challenges of adolescent development. 2/3 of transgender youth report bullying, harassment, and verbal abuse. 43% of transgender youth have been bullied on school property, compared to 18% of cisgender youth. Transgender youth were more likely in 2019 to have been bullied on school property than reported in 2017. Abuses may be perpetuated by parents. However, supportive parent and peers help protect against abuse. So kind of the idea here is that adolescence obviously comes with a whole new set of stressors, environmental shifts, but this is compounded in transgender youth, and you can see this reflective in surveys where 2/3 of transgender youth reporting kind of harassment and bullying, and having higher levels or reporting higher levels of bullying perpetuated against them on school than cisgender kids. And those rates of bullying increasing from 2017 to 2019. So, and you can expect that individuals in poorer neighborhoods and who have just kind of generally less resources in general, whether that's a kind of social resources and or financial resources, would be most at risk for long-term negative developmental outcomes associated with this abuse, from this abuse. However, having supportive peers and families can protect against abuse. So kind of those family protective factors dampening the impact of abuse on transgender's youth developmental trajectories. But as we talked about throughout this course, and I will continue to talk about, we also have these macro level stressors and protective factors. So you have these macro factors of various school districts, legislating anti-trans like bathroom legislation, and just kind of structural barriers to transgender youth and just transgender individuals more generally. Thus kind of contributing to these larger macro stressors, so not just at these individual one-to-one, in this case kind of school peer to school peer kind of interaction, and specifically bullying, but also kind of these larger structural barriers that can create stressors within a transgender youth's life. And those possibly being, actually are associated with higher rates of bullying. So you kind of seeing these larger structural barriers, these larger, transphobic stressors running at like a structural level, at the macro level, as Bronfenbrenner would say, and being correlated with increased rates of bullying on schools. And again, kind of speaking also to this historical period wherein these rates of stressors shift through time. In this case, unfortunately, for transgender youth, rates of bullying increasing, self-reported rates of bullying increased from 2017 to 2019. To bring in kind of a survey of the impact of COVID on trans youth. And since the pandemic began, the crisis calls to Trans Lifeline, which is a crisis telephone line staffed by transgender people, have risen 40% and continue to climb. So you can see some of the crisis calls touched on, ranging from severity, PTSD, medical transition, family rejection, and suicide ideation. So through time, you can see for COVID, I should say. Like all stressors, so these large population level stressors impacting the most vulnerable population in disproportionate ways. So in this case, evidence being that calls to this hotline, this Trans Lifeline, trans youth discussing suicide ideation, PTSD, body dysphoria, etc., increasing from 2015 compared to the beginning of the pandemic in 2019, but obviously more in 2020. In some stage of the transgender identity, we have pre-coming out, coming out, exploration, intimacy, identity integration. However, it's important to note that there is no single path, and depending on social and economic resources and characteristics of a person may, jump from one stage to another, or not even begin kind of just not experience any stage at all. And to kind of briefly go over the stages of transgender identity, pre-coming out, children feel confused as they realize they do not fit into the two gender categories. Coming out, begin to acknowledge to themselves and others that they do not fit the standard gender identities, can occur across the lifespan. Studies show that transgender adults acknowledge feeling different from others as a child. Exploration, learning as much as possible, testing boundaries of what this identity means. Research and consider how best to live, name, clothing, surgery, hormones. Intimacy, transgender men seem to have an easier time than transgender women. Positive intimate relationships are influenced by one's sexual orientation. Like non-transgender youth, heterosexuals have a smoother path than homosexual orientation trans youth. Identity integration, union of one's public and private life. Research indicates that their gender perceptions of self are much like those of transgender children of their expressed roles. So kind of the idea here is that you can see that the other structural barriers and gender stereotypes being reflected within transgender youth as well. Wherein transgender men kind of having a easier time adjusting and kind of navigating the world than transgender women, and heterosexuals having a kind of a smoother path of development than homosexual transgender youth. And research supports the idea that gender perceptions indicated in youth are consistent with gender perceptions and transgender adults as well. And like I said, there's not one specific kind of pathway. Not everyone goes through all these stages or reaches all these stages, and you can imagine just various financial concerns and kind of family concerns. So family not approving of their transgender child, or living in a state or a country or a neighborhood where they could experience violence for coming out as transgender, or maybe be fired for being transgender or something along those lines. So kind of your environment influencing and your personal and kind of environmental resources influencing the trajectory by which you kind of enter these and advance through these stages. And finally, attaining sexual maturity in adolescence. Adolescents incorporate their identities, concepts of themselves as sexual males or females, figure out how to express their sexuality in relationships, become aware of their sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is stable across the lifespan for those who identify as 100% heterosexual and 100% homosexual. Teens who disclose their same-sex orientation to someone report higher levels of self-esteem and overall well-being than teens who have not done so. Those who come out may feel more comfortable with their identity and have the personal resources to manage the stresses that accompany coming out. So kind of the idea here is that through time, adolescents incorporate their identities, or I should say include their sexuality into their identity, that sexual orientation is stable for individuals who identify as 100% heterosexual or homosexual, and teens who disclose their same-sex orientation to peers, but it should be noted to not just peers, but to kind of just self-disclosure more generally, but is associated with increased overall well-being. But of course, it depends on who you're disclosing your same-sex orientation to. Is that person supportive? And also kind of the resources that individual has. And again, that can be personal, social, and financial. So it could be, for example, what could be driving this correlation is that individuals who have higher, resources, broadly speaking, are the ones who are most likely to disclose their same-sex orientation, and thus you're kind of getting this confounding variable when really what's driving this, or at least contributing to this correlation between disclosing same-sex orientation and overall well-being may be the fact that the people who are disclosing already have these resources that they're bringing to the table that allows them to manage the stressors that are associated with coming out. Slightly jumping ahead to cross-cultural gender roles. Cultural variation in gender roles can arise from the different environments within which people live. In those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, such as places where large game is hunting or risky deep-sea fishing is performed, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and toughness of males are more likely to emerge. South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep-sea fishing expeditions to obtain food for their families, and Trukis greatly value masculinity, demonstrated by young men engaging in frequent, violent, drunken fights with knives and clubs. So kind of the idea here is that your environmental context is associated with and contributes to the differences in gender roles. So environments that are harsh, you have to put your life on the line to secure food, secure resources. Cultures of kind of traditionally masculine traits are typically found at higher levels in those types of environments, because you literally have to. The idea behind this is that you literally have to value those traits as kind of like a culture in order to survive. And so if you have to go on dangerous deep-sea diving expeditions to obtain food for your families, you are going to emphasize particular gender roles in society because you need to have those particular gender roles in order to just survive as kind of a people given that harsh terrain. In contrast, in cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful, androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not hunt. The shallow lagoons provide ample fishing without the need to venture into treacherous waters, and the rich volcanic soils allow for the easy harvesting of taro, cassava, coconuts, and fruits. There is virtually no warfare or feuding in Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern for Tahitians. In general, a survey of the norms for masculinity across diverse ecological contexts led one anthropologist to conclude that, quote, the harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed as the inspiration and the goal. So, kind of again here is the idea that these developmental circumstances, in this case, the toughness, the how much really violence and just physical assertion is required to acquire resources within your given environment is associated with particular gender roles. So in this case here, we already talked about the Truk people of South Pacific island of Truk, I should say. Now compared to men in Tahiti who do not have to hunt, and their terrain is much less harsh because of the just kind of the environmental makeup, wherein that they can just fish and they don't have to advance into treacherous waters, and their soil is fertile and able to grow essential crops for that community to survive. There is basically no evidence, or little evidence, I should say, of masculinity being important to this group. In this case, people of Tahiti. And kind of the general takeaway here is that scarcity and harshness in the environment contributes to the development of particular gender roles and behaviors, and with harshness environment contributing to the rigidity of man, or the degree to which manhood is stressed as an inspiration and a goal by a particular culture. So again, this is speaking to these large macro environmental contexts that contribute to individual behaviors, kind of trickling down from these larger environmental contexts. And again, kind of providing further evidence that these gender stereotypes and these gender roles are not these universal across all time biological processes, but rather reflective of larger environmental contexts, whether they're being the harshness of your environment, your economic systems, your political systems, etc. Changes in sexuality in adults. Most have one sexual partner at a time. Married women report somewhat less satisfaction with their sex lives. 75 to 85-year-old men were twice as likely to be sexually active than women, and research shows a decline in sexual desire with age. And the question then becomes, why are there these sexual behavioral changes in as individuals get older, and why are those gender differences occurring? Well, diseases, disabilities, and drugs prescribed for older adults can limit sexual functioning. Social attitudes that view sexual activity in old age as ridiculous or inappropriate. So negative attitudes may be internalized by older people. And lack of partner. So it may not be that there's this kind of this natural biological process wherein just sex falls off a cliff as you get older, but rather it being associated with development of chronic illnesses, disabilities, and drugs, which can limit sexual functioning. But also these larger societal expectations. So we've talked about before that ageism contributing to, or older adults kind of internalizing ageism, and in particular their ability to perform well in cognitive tasks being associated with their performance on a particular cognitive task. So that those stereotype threats that individuals internalize, in this case older adults internalize, and they end up kind of like doing a self-fulfilling prophecy wherein they are aware of those societal attitudes, those expectations around them, and because they're so hyper aware about it that they end up actually fulfilling it. And in this case, sexual activity of older adults are kind of thought of as like absurd. So therefore, older adults will internalize that behavior and then thus have less sexual activity. And finally, lack of partner. So why is it that men may be more sexually active than women? Is because women live longer, and thus when they reach a certain age, 85 years old or whatever, past the average lifespan for a man, there's literally just no older men around them, and there's only female peers, which if they're heterosexual, contributes to a lack of sexual partner, and thus they're going to have lower rates of sexual activities compared to males. All right, so that's all for this week. Thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you next week. And of course, have a great week. Bye.